The woman calling herself Miss Kate Hartley had been dead for 5 years. The death certificate, signed by a midwife and witnessed by Margaret Evans, confirmed it. Catherine Holland, expired November 3, 1814, complications of childbirth. Yet here she stood in the servants' corridor of Dawson Manor, listening to her daughter ask why her real mother hadn't loved her enough to stay. The answer came in Margaret Evans' honeyed voice, drifting through the breakfast room door, because wicked women care only for themselves, darling. That's why God took her away. Catherine's hands trembled against the wallpaper. She should leave. Turn around, collect her carpetbag from the kitchen, disappear back into the London fog where ghosts belonged. But then she heard the sound that had haunted 5 years of fever dreams and starvation, a child's muffled sob. She had arrived at dawn, credentials forged, references invented, desperation masked as competence. The housekeeper had barely glanced at her papers before hiring her. Music teachers were difficult to find in November, especially ones willing to work for room and board alone. Catherine had counted on that. Had counted on her gauntness making her unrecognizable. Had counted on Margaret Evans' arrogance blinding her to the impossible. The breakfast room door opened. A small boy emerged, milk staining his collar, fear bright in his eyes. William. Her son. 5 years old and utterly unaware that the woman watching him from the shadows had once held him against her heart while bleeding out onto a midwife's floor, that he walked past her without seeing her. Children never looked at servants. Margaret's voice followed him into the hallway, sharp as cut glass. Miss Hartley. The new music teacher. Come inside. I want to see exactly who I've hired. Hello, dear friends. Before we begin this heart-wrenching story, make sure you subscribe and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. Catherine forced herself to step into the breakfast room. Her entrance was deliberate, timed precisely as Margaret's hand hovered above William's face. The boy had gone rigid, eyes squeezed shut, waiting for the blow he clearly knew was coming. Lady Evans. Catherine's voice came out steadier than her racing pulse. I'm Miss Kate Hartley. The new music teacher. Margaret's hand froze midair. She turned slowly, her expression shifting from rage to practiced elegance in a single breath. The transformation was masterful. Terrifying. Ah yes. Mrs. Pembroke mentioned you arrived early. Her eyes swept over Catherine with the cold assessment of someone appraising livestock. You're thinner than I expected. Can you even reach the higher keys? Catherine kept her gaze lowered, her posture submissive. 5 years of poverty had taught her how to become invisible. I assure you, my lady, my capabilities are sound. My previous employer found no fault with my instruction. Your previous employer is conveniently deceased, according to your references. Margaret's tone sharpened. How convenient for you. The triplets watched in frozen silence. William had opened his eyes, the spilled milk pooling near his plate forgotten. Charlotte, pale and anxious, gripped the edge of the table with white knuckles. Eleanor, the smallest, stared at Catherine with an intensity that made Catherine's chest constrict. Did she see something? Remember something impossible? Consumption took the household quickly, Catherine lied, each word bitter on her tongue. I was fortunate to escape infection. Margaret circled her like a predator evaluating prey. Catherine could smell her perfume, expensive and cloying, the same scent that had clung to Christopher's coat the last time she'd seen him. The memory stabbed fresh even after 5 years. You have an interesting face, Miss Hartley. Not pretty, but distinctive. Those eyes especially. Almost gray in this light. Catherine's heart hammered. Her eyes had always been her most recognizable feature. Christopher had once called them storm-colored, had traced her cheekbones and memorized every plane of her face. But that woman had been fuller, healthier, alive in ways Catherine no longer was. My mother's eyes, my lady. A common enough shade. Margaret returned to her seat at the head of the table, positioning herself where the Duchess once sat, where she had no legal right to be. The children will require strict discipline. They've been coddled by their previous instructor. William especially has a tendency toward willfulness. She glanced at the boy with undisguised coldness. He forgets his place. William's jaw clenched. Catherine saw Christopher in that stubborn set, saw herself in the way he tried to swallow his anger. Her firstborn. 3 minutes older than his sisters. She'd labored for 18 hours to bring him into the world, and he sat 5 feet away without knowing her. That I find music instruction works best with patience rather than severity, Catherine said carefully. Children respond better to encouragement. Margaret's laugh was ice. How progressive. Tell me, Miss Hartley, do you have children of your own? You seem to have opinions about their management. The question was a trap. Catherine felt its teeth. No, my lady. I've never married. That I thought not. You have that look about you. Untouched. Unburdened by real responsibility. Margaret lifted her teacup with practiced grace. I, however, have raised these 3 from infancy. I know what they require. Structure. Discipline. Constant correction. Their mother's blood runs through them, after all. Bad breeding must be carefully managed. Catherine's nails bit into her palms. She wanted to lunge across the table, to scream the truth until the walls shook. Instead, she nodded. Of course, my lady. I defer to your superior experience. Good. Margaret's smile didn't reach her eyes. You may begin lessons this afternoon. 2 hours daily. If the children show insufficient progress, I'll reconsider your employment. She paused, tilting her head. You seem familiar, Miss Hartley. Have we met before? Catherine's blood turned to ice. Every instinct screamed run. But William was still watching her with those 2 old eyes, and Charlotte had started picking at her food with mechanical movements that spoke of years of fear, and Eleanor reached toward Catherine with one small hand before catching herself. No, my lady. Catherine forced a self-deprecating smile. I have one of those faces. Quite forgettable, I'm told. Margaret studied her for 3 heartbeats too long. Perhaps. Or perhaps you simply remind me of someone who no longer matters. She dismissed Catherine with a wave. Mrs. Pembroke will show you to your quarters. Don't let me detain you. Catherine curtsied and retreated, feeling Margaret's gaze burning into her spine. She'd made it past the first test. But Margaret was suspicious. And suspicion, in a woman with everything to lose, was more dangerous than certainty. Eleanor's fingers stumbled over the keys for the 3rd time, and Catherine had to grip the edge of the piano bench to keep from reaching out to correct them the way a mother would. Not a teacher. A mother. Try again, sweetheart. G major, remember? 3 sharps. The endearment slipped out before Catherine could stop it. William's head snapped up from his scales, suspicious. He'd been watching her since the lesson began, cataloging every expression, every gesture. Christopher's son in every stubborn line of his jaw. Charlotte bit her lip while concentrating on her finger placement. Catherine's own habit, inherited and unconscious. The recognition was a knife between her ribs. She'd done that while pregnant, sitting in the servants' quarters, practicing the lullabies she'd planned to sing to them. None of them would ever know, Miss Hartley. Eleanor abandoned the keys entirely and turned on the bench. Why do you look sad when you look at us? Catherine's breath caught. William and Charlotte both stared now, 3 pairs of eyes too perceptive for their age. Children raised in fear learn to read faces the way sailors read storms. They were waiting for her to lie. I had children once. The words came out raw, unplanned. You remind me of them. It wasn't entirely false. These were her children. They simply didn't know it. What happened to them? Charlotte asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Catherine forced herself to meet their gazes. I lost them. A long time ago. William's expression softened slightly, and Catherine saw the boy he might have been in a different life, raised with gentleness instead of Margaret's calculating cruelty. I'm sorry, Miss Hartley. That must hurt very much. Catherine had to look away before her composure shattered entirely. Back to your scales now. All of you. Your Mama Margaret expects progress. The title tasted like poison, but she made herself say it. Made herself complicit in the lie. For now, midnight found Catherine in the darkened corridor outside Christopher's study. The household had settled into silence an hour ago. She'd memorized the servants' routines on her first day, noted which floorboards creaked, which doors had loose hinges. 5 years of survival had taught her to move like smoke. The study door yielded to the lockpick she'd stolen from a pawnshop in 7 Dials. Inside, moonlight illuminated Christopher's desk, his papers, the portrait of his late wife that still hung above the mantel. Catherine ignored the stab of old jealousy. The Duchess had been kind to her once, before the illness. Before everything fractured, she found the locked drawer in his desk after 10 minutes of searching. The lock was better quality, required patience. Her hands shook as she worked the picks. If Margaret caught her here, there would be no explanation convincing enough, no lie smooth enough to save her. The drawer opened with a soft click that sounded like thunder in the silent room. Inside, letters from the Dowager Duchess demanding proof of the children's legitimacy. Margaret's replies, measured and cold. Baptismal records listing Margaret Evans as mother, the forgeries so skillful Catherine almost believed it herself. And beneath it all, the document she'd signed while hemorrhaging, while Margaret whispered promises about the children wanting for nothing. The midwife's signature had been altered. Where it once read, "Witness the mother's signature," someone had carefully changed it to, "Witness the mother's death." Catherine's vision blurred. Margaret hadn't just stolen her children. She'd murdered her on paper, erased her from existence with a few strokes of a pen. She pulled the camera from her pocket, borrowed from a journalist she'd befriended in her first desperate weeks back in London. Her hands steadied as she photographed each document, the mechanical precision calming her rage into something sharper. More useful. 3 photographs. 4. 5. Footsteps in the corridor. Catherine's heart stopped. She shoved the documents back into the drawer, locked it with shaking fingers, and slipped behind the heavy curtains just as the study door opened. Margaret's voice cut through the darkness. "I don't care what it costs. I want to know everything about her. Where she came from. Who she really is." A pause. "The music teacher. Miss Hartley. Something about her face bothers me." A man's voice responded, low and careful. "You think she's lying about her credentials?" "I think she's lying about everything." Margaret's footsteps crossed to Christopher's desk. Catherine pressed herself against the wall behind the curtain, barely breathing. "Find out who she was before she came here. Find out why a woman with her education is desperate enough to work for room and board alone, and if I find something." Margaret's laugh was soft and lethal. "Then we'll remind Miss Hartley that women with secrets should be more careful about whose household they infiltrate." The study door closed. Catherine waited 5 minutes, then 10, before emerging from behind the curtains. Her legs trembled as she crossed back to the servants' stairs. Margaret had hired someone to investigate her. The false identity she'd constructed so carefully, the fabricated references and borrowed credentials, would crumble under scrutiny. She had days at most before Margaret discovered the truth. The hunter had become the hunted. And Catherine had no idea how to survive what came next. The telegram arrived during breakfast, and Margaret's teacup shattered against her saucer. Catherine watched from her position by the piano as Margaret's carefully constructed composure cracked like ice in spring. "He's coming home early." Margaret's voice was thin, almost breathless. 3 days. Not 3 weeks. 3 days. The housekeeper rushed forward to clean the spilled tea. Margaret waved her away with trembling hands. "Get the staff together. Every room must be perfect. The silver polished. Fresh flowers in his chambers. And the children." She turned to stare at William, Charlotte, and Eleanor with an intensity that made them shrink into their chairs. "The children must be flawless." Catherine's pulse hammered. "Christopher. Here." In 3 days, she wasn't ready. Hadn't gathered enough evidence, hadn't secured legal counsel, hadn't built a strong enough case. And now the man who'd abandoned her would walk through those doors, and she'd have to stand in the same room with him and pretend to be a stranger. Margaret stood abruptly, smoothing her skirts with mechanical precision. "Your father is coming home," she announced to the triplets. "You will be perfect, that he must see how well I've raised you, how devoted I've been, how much you need me." Her smile was sharp as broken glass. "He must see that I'm the only mother you'll ever need, so he'll finally make me your true mother in every way." Catherine understood then. Margaret wasn't just playing house. She was angling for a proposal, for legal legitimacy, for the Duchess's coronet she'd been denied when Christopher's wife still lived. The children weren't Margaret's to love. They were her leverage. Her currency. William's face went carefully blank, the expression of a child who'd learned that showing fear only made things worse. Charlotte twisted her napkin until her knuckles whitened. Only Eleanor seemed confused, too young to fully grasp what was happening. "May I take the children for their lesson in the garden?" Catherine asked, keeping her voice steady. "The fresh air helps their concentration." Margaret barely glanced at her. "Fine. But they're to practice their curtsies and bows. Their father expects proper deportment at in the garden." Eleanor clung to Catherine's hand while William kicked at loose stones with calculated violence. Charlotte hummed anxiously under her breath, a tuneless melody that spoke of nerves stretched too tight. "That I have nightmares," Eleanor said suddenly. She looked up at Catherine with Christopher's dark eyes. "About the bad mama who didn't want us. Mama Margaret says she was wicked, but in my dreams she's crying." "Why would a wicked person cry?" Catherine's chest constricted. She knelt in the damp grass, heedless of her skirts, and took both of Eleanor's hands in hers. What if her voice cracked? She tried again. "What if the mama loved you so much that she gave you away to keep you safe? What if she's been looking for you ever since, trying to find her way back?" William stopped kicking stones. "That's not what Mama Margaret told us." "Stories have different versions," Catherine said carefully. "Sometimes the people telling them don't know the whole truth." Charlotte moved closer, drawn by something in Catherine's voice. "Was the mama sad when she had to give them away?" "Yes." Catherine's throat burned. She was devastated. But she thought it was the only way to save them. Eleanor's small face scrunched in concentration. "Did she ever find them again?" "I don't know yet," Catherine whispered. "The story isn't finished." William studied her with unsettling intensity. "Is that a true story, Miss Hartley?" Catherine couldn't answer. Couldn't lie and couldn't tell the truth. She stood abruptly, brushing grass from her skirts. "Time for your bowing practice. Your father will expect perfection." But William was still watching her, puzzle pieces assembling in his too clever mind. That evening, Catherine slipped into Christopher's study one last time. She told herself she needed to check if Margaret had moved the documents, if the drawer had been searched. But the truth drew her to the portrait above the fireplace. Christopher at 30, painted 5 years ago when his wife still lived and Catherine had been his children's governess and the whole disaster hadn't yet unfolded. He looked younger in the portrait, unmarked by guilt. This was the man who'd found her in the library one winter evening, who'd asked her opinion on Byron and been surprised when she'd had intelligent answers. The man who'd touched her face during his wife's final illness and called her his salvation, who'd promised her forever in desperate whispers, the man who'd fled to the continent 3 days after his wife's funeral rather than face the scandal of loving a governess. Catherine stared at the painted face, and her grief crystallized into something harder. Clearer. He'd made her promises and broken them. He'd left her to die and never looked back. He'd let Margaret steal their children and hadn't questioned it because believing was easier than investigating. She would take back her children. And she would make him watch every moment of his reckoning. Footsteps in the corridor. Catherine turned as Margaret materialized in the doorway, her expression cold with calculation. "Admiring His Grace's portrait, Miss Hartley?" Margaret stepped into the room, closing the door behind her with deliberate softness. "How presumptuous." Catherine kept her face neutral. "I apologize, my lady. I was looking for the sheet music you requested. In His Grace's private study." Margaret moved closer. I know what you are. Catherine's heart stopped. This was it. Margaret knew. The investigation had uncovered the truth and Catherine's time was over, and you're one of those charity cases who thinks playing piano makes you a lady. Margaret's smile was venomous. You look at my home, my children, my life, and think you deserve even a fraction of it. But you don't, Miss Hartley. You're a servant. Nothing more. Relief and fury warred in Catherine's chest. Margaret didn't know. Not yet. Remember your place, Margaret continued, her voice dropping to a hiss. Or I'll remind you of it in ways you won't enjoy. Catherine curtsied with perfect subservience, hating every second. Of course, my lady. Forgive my intrusion. She fled before her composure could crack, before she could say something that would shatter her disguise. But as she reached the servants' stairs, she heard Margaret speaking to someone in the study, her voice carrying down the hallway. Accelerate the investigation. I want answers before His Grace arrives. Something about that woman is wrong, and I will not have her here when Christopher comes home. The net was closing. And Catherine had 3 days to decide, reveal herself now and risk everything, or wait and pray. Margaret's investigator was slower than her desperation. The storm arrived before he did. Catherine watched from the nursery window as thunder rolled across Ashmore's grounds, dark clouds swallowing the afternoon light. Then she saw the carriage black lacquer gleaming in the rain, the Ashmore crest blazing gold on its door. Her hands went cold. Christopher Dawson stepped onto the gravel drive like a man returning from war. 3 years had carved lines around his mouth and threaded silver through his dark hair, but God help her, he was still the man who had whispered promises against her skin. The man who had vanished when those promises became inconvenient. Margaret appeared in the doorway before the wheels stopped turning, silk skirts gathered in one practiced hand, her smile radiant. She moved like a woman greeting her husband, not her lover. Christopher descended and she touched his arm with easy familiarity, tilting her face up for a kiss he delivered without hesitation. Catherine's stomach twisted. Papa. Violet's shriek echoed from the entrance hall below. The triplets rushed outside, and Catherine watched Christopher kneel in the mud, heedless of his expensive coat, gathering all 3 children into his arms. His face crumpled with something that looked like grief. He held Edmund's face between his hands, studied Rose's smile, pressed his lips to Violet's forehead. Look how you've grown, he murmured. Look at you. Margaret's hand settled on his shoulder like a brand of ownership. They've missed you desperately. Come inside before you all catch your death. Catherine stepped back from the window before someone glanced up and saw the ghost watching from the nursery. Dinner was agony. Mrs. Thorne, the housekeeper, had summoned Catherine to help serve when the regular footman fell ill. Just for tonight, Miss Hartley. You'll hardly be noticed. Catherine wanted to refuse, wanted to flee, but she forced herself down the servants' stairs with a water pitcher clutched in trembling hands. The dining room blazed with candlelight. Christopher sat at the head of the table, Margaret at his right, resplendent in emerald silk. Catherine's emerald, the one he'd given her the night Violet was conceived. The children had been fed earlier, thank God. Catherine wouldn't have survived watching them call Margaret Mama across the roast duck. She kept her head down, refilling glasses, fading into the wallpaper the way she'd learned to do. Christopher was recounting something about Parliament, his voice deeper than she remembered. Margaret laughed at all the right moments, her fingers toying with her wine stem in a way that made Catherine want to smash the pitcher against the wall. Then Catherine leaned forward to pour Christopher's wine and the world tilted. His gaze drifted toward her, dismissive, automatic, then stopped. Snapped back. His face went white as bone. Catherine kept pouring, kept her hand steady even as her pulse thundered in her ears. She straightened and stepped back, eyes fixed on the middle distance like a proper servant. Christopher. Margaret's voice sharpened. Are you unwell? You look as though you've seen a ghost. The word hung in the air like poison. Christopher's throat worked. The new music teacher, he said slowly. She reminds me of someone. Margaret's laugh was bright and brittle as breaking glass. A common face, darling. You know how these impoverished gentlewomen all look the same. Forgive me, Miss Hartley, she added with false sweetness, but you do have rather unremarkable features. Catherine curtsied, said nothing, and walked from the room before her composure shattered. In the servants' hall she pressed her back against the cold stone wall and fought to breathe. He'd recognized her. Part of him had, at least. The question was whether he'd pursue it or convince himself he was imagining things. She had her answer an hour later when Mrs. Thorne appeared in the music room. His Grace requests an audience with you, Miss Hartley, the library. Immediately. Catherine's blood turned to ice. Did he say why? Something about the children's education. Mrs. Thorne's expression suggested she didn't believe that for a moment. Best not keep him waiting. The walk to the library felt like walking to the gallows. Catherine smoothed her plain grey dress, pushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and knocked twice. Enter. Christopher stood by the fire, his back to the door. He'd removed his dinner jacket and his shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, an intimacy that made Catherine's chest ache. He didn't turn when she closed the door, the silence stretched, excruciating. Finally he spoke, his voice rough. Tell me, Miss Hartley, do you believe in ghosts? He turned slowly, and his eyes, those blue eyes that had once looked at her like she hung the moon, locked onto hers with terrible precision. Because I'm looking at one. Catherine forced her spine straight, her voice steady. Your Grace, I'm a music teacher from Hampshire. Nothing more. The lie tasted like ash. Christopher moved toward her, slow and deliberate, like a hunter who'd finally cornered his prey. Catherine Holland died 5 years ago. I have the death certificate Margaret provided. Signed by a physician. Witnessed. Official. He stopped inches from her, close enough that she could smell the brandy on his breath. But you have her eyes. That particular shade of grey that looks silver in candlelight. Catherine's pulse hammered against her throat, but she held his gaze. Many women have grey eyes. Her voice when she's angry. He circled behind her and she felt exposed, vulnerable. That slight rasp, like she's swallowed tears. The way she used to touch her wrist when she lied. His hand shot out and caught hers. Like you're doing right now. Catherine wrenched free, and something inside her cracked open. 5 years of silence. 5 years of swallowing her rage. And what would you do, Your Grace, if Catherine Holland walked through that door? Her voice rose, sharp as broken glass. Would you apologize for abandoning her while she birthed your children in a charity hospital? Would you explain why your mistress was given custody while Catherine was declared unfit? Christopher's face drained of color. Or would you simply run again? Catherine spat. The way you ran to France while she was bleeding out and screaming your name. I thought she was dying. His voice fractured. Margaret told me the physician said there was nothing to be done. That Catherine was fevered, delirious. That she'd signed papers relinquishing. He stopped. His eyes went wide with dawning horror. No. No, she wouldn't have what? Catherine demanded. Lied to you. Forged documents. Stolen 3 children and raised them as her own while their mother clawed her way out of poverty. She laughed, bitter and broken. You were too consumed with guilt to question any of it, weren't you? Too devastated by your tragic loss to wonder why Margaret appeared so conveniently with solutions. Christopher staggered backward like she'd struck him. His hand found the edge of his desk, gripping it white-knuckled. My God. You're alive, the words came out strangled. The children, Margaret said you'd wanted them taken somewhere safe. That you couldn't bear the shame. That you'd written a letter before I what? Catherine's fury was a living thing now, burning through her chest. Died conveniently so your mistress could play mother to your bastards. So she could step into my place in your bed and your life while I was starving in the streets. Catherine, don't. She held up a hand, trembling with rage. Don't you dare say my name like it means something to you. Margaret said I was dead. Margaret said I abandoned them. Margaret has been lying to you for 5 years. She moved closer, forcing him to look at her. And you were too busy mourning the idea of me to question whether any of it was true. The truth was assembling itself in his mind. She could see it happening, piece by terrible. Peace. His face went from white to gray. She told me you'd suffered. That you'd begged her to take the children before you. His voice broke. I visited your grave every week. I brought white roses. I told you I was sorry, that I don't want your apologies. Catherine's voice was ice now. I want my children to know I didn't abandon them. I want them to know their mother fought to come back. That she never stopped fighting. Christopher reached for her, his hand shaking. Catherine, please. Let me. She stepped back so fast she nearly tripped. Don't touch me. The words came out savage. You lost that right when you chose her. When you believed her lies without question. When you let yourself be comforted by the woman who destroyed me. She turned toward the door, her vision blurring. Catherine, wait, my name is Miss Hartley. She didn't look back. Catherine Holland is dead. You made sure of that. She yanked the door open and walked out, her head high, her hands fisted in her skirts to hide their shaking. For the first time in 5 years she felt powerful instead of broken. For the first time, she'd made him face what he'd done, but 3 steps down the corridor, she saw her. Margaret stood in the shadows near the staircase, still as a portrait. Her face was perfectly composed except for her eyes. They burned with something that looked like murder. She'd heard everything. And the smile that curved her lips was a promise of destruction. Catherine kept walking, but her newfound power crumbled with every step. Because Margaret wasn't afraid. Margaret was calculating. And a woman with nothing to lose was far less dangerous than a woman with everything to protect. Margaret announced the engagement at breakfast, her voice honey-sweet and laced with poison. Christopher and I have decided we've waited long enough. The party will be next Friday. Intimate, of course. Just 200 of our closest friends. Catherine, serving tea at the sideboard, watched Christopher's jaw tighten. He hadn't agreed to this. Margaret was forcing his hand in front of the children, in front of the servants, making refusal impossible without scandal. Papa, does this mean Miss Margaret will be our real mama? Violet asked, her small voice uncertain. She already is, darling. Margaret's smile never wavered. Though some people seem to have trouble remembering that. Her gaze flicked to Catherine, sharp as a blade. The poisoning began that afternoon. Catherine overheard Margaret in the drawing room, her voice pitched to Carrie. I worry about Miss Hartley's attachment to the children. She seems to want to replace me in their affections. It's quite inappropriate, really. By evening, William wouldn't meet Catherine's eyes during his piano lesson. His small hand stumbled over scales he'd mastered weeks ago. Mama, Margaret says you're trying to make us forget our first mother. The one who died. Catherine's throat closed. Your first mother loved you very much, then why did she leave us? His voice cracked, and he was only 8 years old, and this was Margaret's cruelty wearing a child's face. Charlotte's nightmares started that night. Catherine heard her screaming from 3 rooms away and ran in her nightgown to find the little girl thrashing in her bed, sobbing about shadows and graves and a lady with gray eyes who kept disappearing. Only Eleanor still reached for Catherine's hand during morning walks, but even she'd grown quieter, more watchful, as if sensing the storm gathering around them. Catherine knew she was running out of time. She slipped out after dark and walked 2 miles to the village solicitor, her evidence tucked inside her cloak. Mr. Pemberton examined the birth certificates, the forged death notice, the hospital records she'd spent 3 years collecting. His verdict felt like a death sentence. Without witnesses to the coercion, and with you having been legally declared dead, your claim is nearly impossible to prove in court. He removed his spectacles. And his expression was genuinely sympathetic. You need either Miss Evans's written confession or His Grace's testimony against the woman he's publicly planning to marry. Catherine walked back through the darkness wondering which was more impossible. Christopher found her in the music room 3 days later. He looked like he hadn't slept, gray shadows beneath his eyes, his cravat loosened. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it as if blocking her escape. That I loved you. The words came out quiet, devastated. When my wife was dying, when I was drowning in duty and grief, you were the only thing that made me feel human. He crossed to the window, unable to look at her. But I was a coward. I let my family dictate my choices. Let society tell me what was acceptable. When Margaret told me you died in childbirth and the children needed a mother, I believed her because it was easier than facing what I'd done to you. Catherine stood frozen at the pianoforte, her fingers pressed white against the keys. And now? Now I can't breathe without seeing your face in that charity hospital. His voice broke. Wondering what they did to you. How you survived. If you called for me and I wasn't there, I did call for you. Catherine's words were acid, burning through the air between them. 4 months. No one came. She moved toward him, forcing him to face her. Now that you know your mistress built her throne on my grave, what will you choose this time, Christopher? Your reputation, or your children's mother? He opened his mouth to answer and Eleanor's scream shattered the air. They ran. Catherine reached the nursery first and froze in the doorway. Margaret had Eleanor by the arm, shaking her so hard the child's head snapped back. Violet was crying in the corner. William stood paralyzed by the bookshelf. You will call me Mama. Margaret's voice was nearly unrecognizable, shrill and vicious. Not that woman. Me. I raised you. I fed you. I'm your mother. Catherine moved without thinking, crossing the room in 3 strides and wrenching Eleanor from Margaret's grip. She pushed the little girl behind her and stood between Margaret and all 3 children, her body a shield. Don't you dare touch them. Margaret's face transformed. The mask of careful elegance, of practiced maternal warmth, cracked and fell away entirely. What remained was raw hatred, ugly and terrifying. She took a step forward, trembling with rage. You should have stayed dead, Catherine. Her voice dropped to something lethal. I gave you that gift once. I can give it to you again. Christopher appeared in the doorway behind Catherine, his face white with shock. He'd finally seen the monster he'd invited into his home. But Catherine didn't look back at him. She kept her eyes locked on Margaret, on the woman who'd stolen 5 years of her life, and said the only thing that mattered, try it. And this time, I'll make sure the whole world knows what you are. Margaret's laugh cut through the nursery like breaking glass. Oh, Catherine. Did you really think I didn't know? She smoothed her skirts with deliberate calm, her rage condensing into something colder, more lethal. I knew who you were the moment you walked through those gates. I've been watching you watch them, waiting to see how long you'd last before you broke. Catherine's blood turned to ice. You knew. Of course I knew. Margaret's smile was venomous. I've spent 5 years covering my tracks. Did you think I wouldn't notice a ghost haunting my garden? She turned to Christopher, her voice shifting to wounded innocence. I've already contacted Magistrate Thornberry. I have witnesses prepared to testify that this woman attempted to kidnap the Duke's children. She'll hang for it. Or at best, rot in an asylum for claiming to be a dead woman. Christopher stepped forward. His face ashen. Margaret, you can't. I can and I will. She crossed to her writing desk and extracted a folder, laying out papers with practiced precision. Forged letters Catherine supposedly sent, threatening the children unless she was given money. Testimony from 3 servants who witnessed her erratic behavior and violent outbursts. She met Catherine's eyes with triumphant malice. It's a masterful trap, darling. And you walked right into it. Catherine felt the walls closing in. 5 years of fighting, of surviving, and Margaret had anticipated every move. But then she remembered. The midwife. The evidence. The one gamble Margaret hadn't accounted for. You're very thorough, Catherine said quietly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the photographs she'd taken of Margaret's documents. But so am I. Margaret's smile faltered. Catherine laid the images on the desk one by one. The forged death certificate with its telltale inconsistencies. The coerced custody papers. The letters Margaret had written in Catherine's hand. I found these in your locked box 3 weeks ago. I had them examined by a document expert in London. Those prove nothing, Margaret hissed. You could have forged them yourself. She could have. A woman's voice came from the doorway, weathered and certain. But she didn't. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, the midwife who'd attended the triplets' birth, stepped into the nursery. She was gray-haired and humble in her worn traveling cloak, but her eyes were sharp as she looked at Margaret. "I've kept silent long enough," Christopher turned to her, desperate. "Who are you?" "I attended Miss Holland's labor 5 years ago." Mrs. Hartwell's voice was steady. "I watched Miss Evans bring papers to a woman barely conscious from blood loss and fever. I heard her say that signing was the only way the children would be safe." She fixed Margaret with a look of disgust. "And I watched her alter the death certificate after Miss Holland was taken away. She told me if I ever spoke of it, she'd see my own children charged with theft and transported." The silence in the room was absolute. Margaret's face drained of color. "She's lying. She's a drunk and a debtor." "Christopher, you can't believe you told me Catherine died in my arms." Christopher's voice was hollow, shaking. "You said her last words were gratitude. That she blessed us. That she wanted the children raised in comfort rather than shame. Because she was nothing." Margaret's composure shattered completely. "A governess who spread her legs and thought she deserved a duchy. I saved those children from her poverty and her shame. I gave them a mother with breeding and connections. I gave them a future. You gave them lies," Catherine said, her voice breaking. "You stole 5 years of their lives. 5 years of mine that I gave them everything." Margaret was screaming now, unhinged. "What could you have given them? A room in some boarding house? Hunger? Ridicule? I made them heirs. I made them legitimate. You made them orphans while their mother was still breathing." Christopher's words came out strangled. He looked at Margaret as if seeing a monster wearing the face of someone he trusted. "My God! What have you done?" Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but William's small voice cut through the chaos, thin and terrified. "Miss Hartley, are you our real mama?" Everything stopped. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. 3 pairs of eyes turned to Catherine, Violet's wide with confusion, Eleanor's brimming with tears, William's desperate for truth. 4 pairs, if you counted Christopher's, raw with anguish and hope and fear. This was the moment Catherine had dreaded and longed for since the day they were stolen. The moment that could destroy them or save them. Her knees buckled and she sank to the floor before her children, eye level with the babies she'd bled for and nearly died for and spent 5 years crawling back to. "Yes." The word came out choked. "Yes, I'm your mother." Tears streamed down her face and she didn't try to stop them. "And I have been trying to find my way back to you since the day you were born. I have fought through poverty and lies and a grave with my name on it because you are mine and I am yours and nothing could ever make me stop fighting for you." Eleanor moved first, launching herself into Catherine's arms with a sob. Then Violet, hesitant but crying. William stood frozen for one terrible moment before his face crumpled and he collapsed against her chest, and Margaret's scream of rage was the sound of a kingdom falling. They had to drag Margaret from the house. She clawed at the doorframe, screaming that the children would never accept that woman, that Catherine was a hysteric and a liar, that Christopher would regret this the moment society turned its back on him. Her shrieks echoed through the entrance hall even after the carriage door slammed shut. The magistrate arrived within the hour. Magistrate Thornberry was a thin man with sharp eyes who questioned everyone's servants, the midwife, Christopher, Catherine herself. He examined the forged documents, the altered death certificate, the custody papers signed by a woman half dead from blood loss. "Your legal status is a nightmare, Miss Holland," he said bluntly. "You've been declared deceased. Resurrecting yourself requires substantial testimony and influence." Christopher stood immediately. "She'll have both. I'll testify to whatever is needed. I'll sign whatever documents your Grace's word will be essential," Thornberry interrupted. "But be prepared. Society will not be kind to either of you." Catherine barely heard him. She was watching Violet through the window, standing alone in the garden, her small shoulders shaking. The child who'd called Margaret Mama for 5 years. The child whose world had just shattered. Christopher provided his testimony over the next 3 days, his voice flat and mechanical as he detailed Margaret's deception. Catherine sat in the corner of the study during his statements, and she couldn't look at him. Couldn't bear the sight of him trying to fix what he'd broken. "You chose her lies for 5 years, she said one evening when they were alone. That doesn't disappear because the truth finally became undeniable." His face crumpled, but she walked away before he could respond. The children were the real devastation. Violet wouldn't speak to Catherine at all, spending hours in the library Margaret had created for her, reading the books Margaret had selected, wearing the dresses Margaret had commissioned. William watched Catherine with wary distrust during meals, flinching when she reached for his hand during prayers. Only Eleanor, at 3 years old too young to fully understand, still reached for Catherine during their morning walks. "Did you really love us?" she asked one afternoon, her small hand warm in Catherine's. "Even when we didn't know you?" Catherine knelt in the damp grass, not caring about her skirts. "Every single day. Every single moment." "Then why did you leave?" Eleanor's voice was so small, so confused. "That I didn't leave, sweetheart. I was taken from you. And I fought every day to come back, but how did you explain betrayal and coercion to a 3-year-old? How did you compete with 5 years of carefully constructed lies?" Catherine moved into the manor but refused Christopher's offer of a suite in the family wing. She took a servant's room on the 3rd floor, small and sparse and safe. They existed in painful proximity, passing each other in hallways, sitting at opposite ends of the dining table, navigating around each other like ships avoiding a collision. Christopher tried constantly. Leaving books outside her door that he thought she'd enjoy. Asking her opinion on the children's education. Seeking her out in the music room to discuss Eleanor's progress at the pianoforte. They remained civil and distant, a stranger living in his house. Their conversations became battlegrounds of grief and longing. He wanted forgiveness. She wanted to give it. But trust was a bridge that had burned to ash, and neither of them knew how to rebuild it. "Let me help you with the children," he offered one afternoon. "Let me talk to them about what happened." "They don't trust you either," Catherine said quietly. "You let Margaret lie to them. You're as complicit as she was." She watched him absorb that blow, watched something in his eyes break further. One night Catherine couldn't sleep. She found herself in the nursery at 2 in the morning, sitting in the rocking chair where Margaret had once soothed Eleanor's nightmares, where Catherine should have been. The grief was suffocating. 5 years of bedtime stories she'd never told. 5 years of scraped knees she'd never kissed. 5 years of "I love you" she'd never heard. She was crying when Christopher appeared in the doorway. He didn't speak, didn't offer platitudes. He just sat on the floor beside the chair, his back against the wall, and let her weep. Minutes passed. Maybe an hour. Finally he spoke, his voice hoarse. "I robbed you of 5 years with them. I can't give you back that time." He stared at his hands. "But I can give you the rest of my life trying to make amends. If you'll let me." Catherine's response came out broken, raw. "I don't want your penance, Christopher. I don't want your guilt or your desperate attempts to fix what you destroyed." She looked at him and saw the boy she'd loved, the man who'd abandoned her, the father who'd failed their children. "I wanted your courage 5 years ago. I wanted you to believe in me. To fight for me. But you chose the easier path, and now we're both paying for it." He left without another word. The letter arrived the next morning, delivered by private courier. Catherine recognized Margaret's handwriting immediately, that perfect copperplate script that had signed so many lies. She opened it with shaking hands. "The children will never fully forgive you for abandoning them. No matter what the truth was. I made sure of that. I planted seeds of doubt in every bedtime story, every afternoon lesson, every quiet moment. You are a stranger to them, Catherine. And strangers are never trusted like mothers are. You may have won the legal battle. But I've already won the war." Catherine read it twice. 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in her pocket. Margaret was right. The real battle wasn't in courtrooms or testimonies. It was for 3 small hearts that had been taught to love a lie, and Catherine was losing. 3 months later, Violet still flinched when Catherine reached for her hand. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but Catherine felt it like a knife between her ribs every single time. Progress was measured in inches, not miles. In the way William sometimes forgot to call her Catherine, and almost said Mama, before catching himself. In how Eleanor's nightmares were fewer now, but still came often enough that Catherine kept a candle burning in her room. This was the truth Margaret's letter had promised. Winning a legal battle was nothing compared to winning back hearts that had been taught to love someone else, but Catherine showed up anyway. Every morning at breakfast when Violet wouldn't meet her eyes. Every afternoon when William chose to read alone rather than accept her company. Every evening when Eleanor asked, "Will you still be here tomorrow?" As if Catherine might vanish like a dream, always, Catherine promised. "I will always be here." She learned Violet's favorite songs, not the ones Margaret had taught her, but the ones the child hummed when she thought no one was listening. Catherine played them on the pianoforte at bedtime, and one night Violet paused in the doorway to listen before disappearing upstairs. William mentioned wanting to learn fencing. The next day Catherine hired a master and asked if she could watch the lessons. William had looked suspicious at first, but when she cheered his first successful parry, something in his face softened. She told them stories. Not fairy tales, but true ones. About the night they were born during a thunderstorm, how Eleanor had arrived first and screamed so loudly the midwife laughed. How William had grabbed the doctor's finger with surprising strength. How Violet had opened her eyes and looked directly at Catherine as if to say, "So you're my mother that I sang to you every night," Catherine said softly. "Even after I lost you, I sang to empty rooms and pretended you could hear me." "What did you sing?" Eleanor asked. Catherine's voice cracked as she began the lullaby. By the second verse, Eleanor was crying. By the third, she'd crawled into Catherine's lap. Christopher watched from the margins of their lives, present but separate, like a ghost haunting his own house. Catherine would catch him observing her with the children, his expression unreadable. Hungry. Aching. Something that looked like wonder. One evening he found her in the garden, the same garden where they'd kissed 6 years ago under stars that had promised forever. "Walk with me?" he asked quietly. She should have refused. Instead she fell into step beside him, maintaining careful distance between them. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," he began, his voice rough. "I know I failed you in every way that mattered. But I'm asking anyway." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "Not for me. For them. They need to see their mother happy. And Catherine, I still love you. I never stopped. Even when I thought you were dead, even when I tried to move forward with Margaret, you were the only thing that felt real." Catherine's laugh was bitter and broken. "You loved a memory. A girl who doesn't exist anymore. I love who you are now." His hand moved toward hers but stopped. "The woman who fought her way back from death. Who survived 5 years of hell and came out stronger. Who sits up all night with Eleanor and never once complains. That's who I love." Catherine met his eyes. And the words came slowly, carefully, hard-won. "I loved the man who held me under these stars and promised me forever. That man doesn't exist anymore." She saw him flinch but continued. "Neither does the girl who believed him. We're different people now. Broken and rebuilt in ways that don't fit together the way they used to, then we learn new ways to fit." His voice cracked with desperation. "Maybe." Catherine's answer was careful, weighted with years of pain. "If there's anything between us to salvage, it has to be built on who we are now, not who we were. And Christopher, I don't know if I'm capable of trusting you again. I don't know if you've earned it, then let me earn it." He didn't reach for her, didn't push. "However long it takes," she didn't answer. She walked back toward the house, leaving him in the garden with the ghost of promises they'd once believed in. The children's 6th birthday arrived like a fragile gift. Catherine had organized a small party, just family, no society, no pressure. She'd baked the cake herself, despite Cook's protests, because she needed them to know she could do this. That she was learning to be what they needed. The nursery was decorated with ribbons and wildflowers. Violet played hostess with careful formality. William devoured his slice of cake with boyish enthusiasm. Eleanor insisted on sitting in Catherine's lap while they sang. Catherine lit the candles, her hands shaking slightly. 6 candles for 6 years. She'd missed so many of their moments, but she was here now. That had to count for something. Make a wish, she told them. Before they could blow out the candles, Violet spoke, her voice small and uncertain. Can we call you Mama? She looked at her siblings, then back at Catherine. Not Mama Margaret. Just Mama. Catherine's tears came before she could stop them. She pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to breathe through the wave of emotion that threatened to drown her. Yes, the word came out choked. Please. I would love that more than anything, William added quietly, not meeting her eyes. We're sorry we didn't know you. But we want to now. Eleanor wrapped her small arms around Catherine's neck and whispered against her shoulder, You're the Mama who came back. Catherine held them, all 3 of them, feeling the weight and wonder of finally being allowed into their hearts. She looked up through her tears and met Christopher's eyes across the room. He stood in the doorway, excluded from this moment but visibly grateful it existed. She didn't smile. Didn't offer forgiveness or promises. But she didn't look away either. It wasn't a happy ending. It was something harder and more real, the beginning of rebuilding what had been destroyed. It was possibility instead of certainty. Hope instead of resolution, and for the first time in 6 years, Catherine Holland believed she might deserve that.